Hi, this is Margaret Maloney, and welcome to the Death Dhamma podcast. Open and honest discussions with wise and skillful teachers about their experiences with life, death, and Buddhism. If you wonder how others on the path have dealt with death and dying and grief, then be sure to listen in. Everybody has a story, a perspective, and a valuable lesson to share. Embrace death, live a full life, and learn how to love impermanence. Because as my dear father used to say, nobody gets out of this alive. Hello and welcome to the Death Dhamma podcast. I am very excited because today I get to share with you an amazing discussion with Venerable Karma Lekshe Tsomo. She has been a Buddhist nun for over 40 years now, and she is a nun and an activist. And I'm going to stop there because I want you to hear about her from her. So, hi, welcome, let's go.
I'm American. I was born with a family named Zen, which led me directly to Buddhism at a very young age, about 11 years old. And I just took it and ran with it. So I've lived in Asia for about 20 years, mostly studying Buddhism, practicing Buddhism. And about 30 years ago, I got bitten by a poisonous snake, a viper, and almost died. After 3 months in the hospital, in a year of rehab, I was able to continue. I went back to school and wound up accidental professor of Buddhist studies at the University of San Diego. So meanwhile, I've done a lot of work with Buddhist women internationally and also Buddhist education for women, especially in developing countries. I'm involved with 4 nonprofits that I helped found and direct and so forth. Internationally, Sakadita International Association of Buddhist Women is an alliance of Buddhist laywomen and nuns and allies to work for the welfare of the world's 300 million or maybe 600 million Buddhist women. So we hold international conferences every 2 years, which helps to bring women together, to encourage them to exchange ideas, to create forums for social justice work and meditation experience and learning and publications and so forth. The second organization is Jamyang Foundation, which is specifically to support education for women in developing countries. We focus especially on India and Bangladesh. In India, most of the students are nuns, and in Bangladesh, they're young Marma girls. It's elementary education, expanding up, and then we have outreach programs in Laos and Vietnam, Nepal, Mongolia, and so forth. So that's Jamyang Foundation. And then we also created an institute in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha got enlightened, called Sangha Mitra Institute. And this has been particularly a winter study program for Himalayan nuns. The weather is so cold up in the mountains, and the water is now, with global warming, the water situation is really critical. So these programs have been to provide full-time education in Buddhist studies for nuns during the winter months. And they come down to Bodh Gaya and they study intensively there and then return to their home monasteries in the summer months. Then, in addition, we have the local Hawaii chapter of Sakadita Hawaii, and that's based here on Oahu. We're creating a peace center, Lai Peace Center, out in the country on 5 acres of land, which would be a peace resource center for meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, peace and conflict resolution skills, sustainable agriculture, peace education for children, and so on, and adults. So these are the 4 different organizations that I'm involved in.
That's wonderful. I just want to say thank you for all that work, and especially thank you because I believe, perhaps incorrectly, that there are people out there who think that, to be Buddhist means to be passive and to not take action and there you are taking action. And so, my friends out there, if you think this is true, here is this amazing woman, this Buddhist nun who is taking action. And so we don't just sit, we do things. We do things.
I think that Buddhist studies and contemplation entail action. We can't just talk about compassion. We need to engage with it.
Right? Compassion is an action.
Compassion in action, yes. Good.
Yes, beautiful. So, you've already shared with us that you had your own near-death experience being bitten by that poisonous snake. That seems very frightening. And before that, did you have any up close and personal, if I may say it that way, experiences with death? Like, when was the first time that you realized death is not just this vague thing? Death is a reality in our lives, in your life.
Well, I think I must have been very young when one of my grandmothers passed away. And I remember that as children, we were not allowed to attend the funeral. There was a feeling that death was something very dark, something very tragic, something very sad, something not for children. And after that, I think the next experience was with losing my dog.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up in Malibu, and Pacific Coast Highway is treacherous. And my dearly beloved collie, Scampy, was very smart, but got caught in the headlights at night. And, and not just one, but a second collie also. This really, I found devastating. And I couldn't really understand, where did they go? And why? And so that was a lingering question. Ever since I was small, even before that, I used to ask people, what happens to us after we die? And I couldn't really get any straight answers. I would ask the ministers at church. So my parents were Christian. And I really couldn't get an answer beyond, if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. That seemed to be the only two options. And it seemed a little bit simplistic. Surely there was more to it, but what? Nobody could tell me. And that's sort of what led me to one of the things that led me to Buddhism. I remember coming into a class at the Institute of the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala. My first day of class, and finding the Lama explaining in detail the stages of the dying process. And I thought, this is amazing. And I sat at his feet for 6 years to learn everything I could from him. And it came in really handy when I got bitten by a snake. It's not my only close call with death, but it was maybe the most dramatic. And so all of those practices that we learned, the Buddhists talk a lot about death. And we have practices on death and impermanence. It's one of the central meditations, key practices. And yet, when it happens, it's very different. There's a difference between theory and
practice.
Reality, yeah.
Reality. I think that's so amazing that one of the things that kept you into the practice was that you came across someone who was just openly teaching death and talking about, here's what happens, here's what happens. And, I'm just curious. So back when your dog died, which, I know was really difficult. And I know you said you started investigating Buddhism at a young age. Had you started investigating Buddhism yet when Scampy died?
Yes.
Okay.
So no, I came across two books, because I kept getting teased about my name. Oh, are you some sort of Buddhist or what?
Oh, self-defense.
Yeah. And so The Way of Zen by Alan Watts and Zen Buddhism by D.T. Suzuki. And I don't know what fascinated me so much, but I read these books from cover to cover and just found this philosophy was completely appropriate for me. I could resonate with it.
Okay.
And so that led me to explore further. But this was way back in the 50s when there was very little information about Buddhism available.
Oh, sure.
And I would scour the bookshops, these bookshops, but there was very little available at that time. And so and that's what led me to India, actually, to study more. Nowadays, people don't realize how fortunate they are to have such a wealth of information at their fingertips, translations and commentaries and, even podcasts and, everything. It's amazing.
We are really fortunate. It is true. And so I'm guessing if you had gone to your family priest or pastor, and asked where did Scampi go? Sometimes we get the answer, animals don't have souls, they don't go anywhere. Sometimes we get the pat, of course, your little dog's in heaven. So how did you work out on your own what happened? Because you were already studying Buddhism, because you were Buddhist, from such an early age. And so I'm thinking that you probably began to work out on your own what had happened to your dog.
Unfortunately, I had no resources to turn to at that time about these big questions. I just had to look inside, and I really couldn't find the answers until I looked deeper into Buddhism and found that they have a whole system of understanding death, life, and rebirth. You see, and that made a lot of sense to me, because the idea that we die and we just disappear into nothingness doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, the material body, of course, decomposes, but what about the consciousness? Where does it go? And the idea of going to heaven, it was too abstract. The rebirth theory made a lot more sense to me at that time, and also now. The whole idea of karma, cause and effect, and how it continues over lifetimes. To me, this idea is much more reasonable, sounds more sensible.
I remember as a child, and I have no idea as a child where I first came upon the idea of rebirth, because I grew up in Southern California in the San Gabriel Valley. And my family was Catholic, and so we were probably taught similar things by our family religions. And I can remember that the concept of rebirth just made sense to me, and it was just something that made sense. I didn't understand or come across Buddhism until much later in my life than you did. And then when I did, it was like, oh, it was like this, Maybe you would be comfortable sharing with us an outline of parts of the process of dying and rebirth that you find to be the most helpful for us. Would you mind doing something like that?
Well, I think the most important thing is to recognize that the way we live our lives will set the stage for how we die. If we live a life of kindness, compassion, doing our best to achieve wisdom, gain wisdom through life experience, we will, if we do wholesome actions, try to avoid unwholesome actions. In other words, lead an ethical life. Then I think that our future will be more or less, it will shape up nicely for us. Okay. We cannot predict exactly where we will take rebirth at this point, unless we have done an awful lot of meditation experience. And even then, because everything depends on causes and conditions. But the overall view is that if we live an ethical, compassionate life, really our future is assured. We don't have to worry about it. We can't say exactly where and how we will be reborn, but on the contrary, by contrast, if we live a life of greed, hatred, anger, and engage continually in unwholesome actions, then we're setting the stage for unhappiness for ourselves. Now, we can think about this as what we will experience during the dying process. Imagine, we slog along for 60, 70 years, and then we face dying.
Mm-hmm.
And, the life review sort of thing, the regrets that arise about how we've treated people, actions that we've done that we may then recognize were not wholesome, were not kind. This all comes to mind as we're navigating the process of dying.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if we've done a lot of meditation, first of all, hopefully we'll be able to maintain awareness during that process. We'll be able to remain calm. Don't panic. Don't freak out. Don't be afraid. We'll have a better idea what to expect if we study the stages of the dying process. And through our meditation practice,
Mm-hmm.
we'll be better able to navigate those stages with a clear, calm mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very, very important.
Absolutely. And I feel like, because there are, to state it simply, there are different ways of being a Buddhist, right? But I do seem to find that the concept of the peaceful death and to not flail, and the state of mind when you die, to be a really common belief in terms of what happens next. You went through, you've mentioned more than one experience. Did you start to get yourself ready?
Yes, of course. I mean, since I was a child, I was doing what I thought was meditation. Of course, I didn't really meet qualified meditation instructors until later in life, after I went to Dharamsala, I suppose. Or to India, in the 60s, and started to meditate and learn different meditation techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of preparation I found very, very helpful, not only for death, but for life.
Yeah.
And it's a matter of transforming the mind, which makes us better able to meet any circumstance, all the ups and downs of life,
Mm-hmm.
riding the waves of life sort of thing. And so I find that really useful. The more meditation we do, the better position we're going to be in to meet tragedies, and also to meet death. I mean, look at the current circumstances. During a pandemic, so many people are really depressed, gripped with anxiety, angry, and we're not just facing a health crisis, we're also facing an environmental crisis, an economic crisis, a political crisis, multiple crises. But what I'm finding is that people who have done a lot of meditation practice are in a much better position to maintain their mental health, and also to become a resource for others around them. So we can see in practical terms the benefits of Buddhist practice, not just meditation practice, but also understanding the framework of how to train our minds, how to tame our emotional afflictions.
Absolutely. You remind me, I can recall asking a teacher once, what can I do what can I do to be in better shape, to be of more help to others? And he just looked at me and he said, meditate more. And, and I feel like this is what you're saying too, because this is what brings the strength and the resolve and the calm. And, I'm online a little bit doing my work, and, things pop up, and more, and this is a good thing if it's presented in a helpful way, more and more when we see those stories of, how to help yourself during the pandemic, self-care during the pandemic, how to take care of your mental health during the pandemic, they almost always now include some discussion of meditation and mindfulness. And there it is. You've got these experiences. I guess I'm curious about how you have experienced grief when you have lost others. What was that like? Maybe I'll say earlier in your Buddhism and today.
Well, I think when I was young, I didn't have the tools to deal with it well.
Mm-hmm.
When Scampy and my other dog passed away, I was just in a very sad, very dark place
Mm-hmm.
with no resources to draw on. And I was still quite young,
Yeah.
about 12 years old,
Mm-hmm.
And gradually, as I studied more about Buddhism, I came to realize that death is a universal experience. It's not just me who's experiencing loss and grief. This
Mm-hmm.
is something that's experienced eventually by everyone. And the more I learned about it, the more it made sense that if we accept this reality, if we recognize that death is part of our common experience, there's no way we can get around it. Some people are more fortunate than others, and maybe only lose loved ones later in life or something. But some have to face it very early on. I know one friend that I was just spending time with had lost both of her parents in a tragic car accident when she was about 7, and I think that sadness has stayed with her whole life.
Uh-huh.
If she had had some appropriate counseling at the time, maybe someone could have helped her understand that although it's definitely tragic to lose your parents when you're 7, ultimately we all have to leave this world. The humans and animals, the birds, even we could say the plants. There's a life cycle.
Yes.
And there are ways to help children understand that this is not just some sort of punishment from on high. It's not a tragedy that affects only them, but to put it in a larger context. This would help a great deal. So the more I learned about this, the more I meditated on it. The
Mm-hmm.
meditation on death and impermanence really comes down to the molecular level. We can actually get in touch with how the molecules of our body are arising and perishing moment to moment. There's nothing static about us. We're
So
changing all the time.
we're always being born and we're always dying over and over
And
again throughout every day.
they say we've been dying since we were born.
Right? The minute we came out, or even before, I would suppose it. From the moment of conception, I suppose I guess that's a discussion for another day. But absolutely, has there been anything that you found surprising in your experiences with death and dying and grief? Anything that you're like, oh, that was surprising, or that was interesting?
It's interesting to see how people in different cultures deal with death differently.
Ah, okay.
And this could relate not only to culture, but also to religious or, worldviews, economics, social situations.
Mm-hmm.
We all live as part of a larger community. We're all born into a family of some description. And all of these things influence the way that we understand and the way that we handle death. So there's tremendous variety, even within the Buddhist world. What I've found is that people who are aware of this teaching on death is definite, but the time of death is indefinite.
I love that saying. Mm-hmm.
Yes, are better able to handle the experiences of dying. I recall one time seeing a funeral for a young man who had passed away in a motorcycle accident. I was staying at a monastery in northeastern Thailand, and the young man who helped the nuns helped out at the monastery had been hit on the road, and we were called to the funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went, I saw his parents, who of course were grief stricken. He was their only child,
Ouch.
and yet they handled this experience of loss with such dignity, with
Mm-hmm.
such wisdom, with such decorum. You could see the sadness, and yet they were able to understand it within the framework of the Buddhist teachings on death and impermanence. And this helped them to cope with their grief, cope with their loss. I was so impressed. People could have PhDs or, millions of attainments, and yet not understand these basic life skills, how to deal with the tragedies, the inevitable misfortunes of life. So this simple peasant family were able to process this calmly and compassionately. It was so beautiful to see.
I feel like as you're speaking, I'm picturing and I'm thinking, because they had the deepest type of wisdom. And
Yes.
obviously, I'm not against book learning, and neither are you. But there's a lot to be said for that. There's the knowing something in the head, and then there's the knowing something with the heart. And they knew with their hearts.
Well, and their Buddhist understanding had prepared them for something like this. They understood that their son had lived a good life. He was helping the monastery. He was creating wholesome actions every day. And so even though they were mourning, and yet they could also take solace in understanding that their son had lived a very good life by helping the nuns and so on. That, someone could live for 100 years, but not have that kind of good fortune. And in addition, because of his strong connection with the monastery, all of the nuns were immediately ready to say prayers for him the very same day. So they could give him a very good send-off. And they believe that by sending good thoughts to the person, it will help their wholesome karma to ripen well in order to achieve a wholesome, fortunate rebirth. So in a way, although it was a tragedy from one perspective, from another point of view, he was actually in one of the most fortunate circumstances.
So in a sense, he had a type of a good death.
Dying in an accident is, you could analyze that from various points of view. Dying a sudden death in one sense is fortunate, that you don't linger in pain for years and years. Sure. On the other hand, dying a sudden death means that you don't really have time to completely prepare your mind for the transition.
That is true.
They say that someone who dies in a sudden accident takes another existence immediately.
Oh, okay. Because of the confusion?
No, because of the suddenness.
Okay.
And so now, in the case of a person who's done a lot of meditation, it would be an advantage to go slowly through the process of dying, so that one could understand all the different stages of the dissolution of the body and mind. It takes training. It takes, practice.
Probably a lot of training. A lot of training.
Right.
So somebody comes to you, as I'm positive that people do, and they come to you and they're bereft and they're grief stricken, and they feel like, and they're Buddhist, and now they're feeling like my Buddhism isn't working. What would you do to help that person?
Well, I think I've never encountered that situation. Most people who have practiced Buddhism and studied Buddhism can always draw on that for coping with any circumstance. So there are many different techniques that one can use. The one I just mentioned, which is recognizing the inevitability of death and the uncertainty of the time of death. Most Buddhists would be aware of that. That's already a resource. We have to face the fact that we have to deal with our own loss and grief. Nobody can do that for us. They can help us through it. And sometimes the best way to help is just be a quiet presence. I have friends right now who are going through the process, and they just need silence and time to adjust to the loss. Another technique is to face your grief directly. So what is it actually that is so painful about losing a loved one? If we look inside, we feel the tightness in our chest, a sense of heaviness, a sense of uncertainty, a sense of great loss. Instead of turning away from it, which sometimes can compound the suffering, we look directly at it. And because all things are impermanent, that grief we also see is impermanent. As we look directly into it, it begins to dissolve, to disentangle, and it loses its grip on our heart. so that the pain, the tightness that we've been feeling begins to dissolve. Now, this will take time.
Yes.
It may take up to a year. We have to give ourselves time. There are many other things we can do too, which is to remember the positive moments that we spent with this person. Remember their qualities, remember their kindness. Remember the good times. Why should they be overwhelmed by just the moment of loss? We should appreciate that the time that we had spent together and not sort of erase all of that. It's not gone. We still can rejoice in that person's wonderful qualities, right?
I do. I think that's very helpful. For maybe some, it's a redirection, if you will, which is I still am feeling grief and I miss that person because I'm struggling with impermanence and attachment. But I also have had the honor, the wonder of that person and I being together on the planet together at the same time. And
Right.
that is a wonderful, joyous thing.
Mhm.
And to concentrate on that, but not to try to cling to it and go, oh, I want that back. Oh, I wish it would come back, because it's not going to, and that just hurts you more, I think.
Definitely. It's the attachment that brings the pain, attachment and clinging. And as if we look directly at them and understand that it's our attachment really is causing our suffering, then we can begin to loosen those bonds too.
Yes.
Replace it with love, pure love, which is quite different in nature from attachment. In the case of attachment, we're looking for something for ourselves. We want that person in our lives to be with us.
Right. Yeah. I want you here because it makes me happy. Or you make me feel better about myself or something, whatever it is, right? I appreciate very much that you mentioned that, grief takes time and the passing of time. I remember people telling me before I went through like some of the losses of my family and, my parents and my husband. And I remember people telling me that there'll be a point where people will turn away because they think you should be done. And I kind of understood it. And then I understood it more when I lived it. And it is when you can have the person who can just be with you and just let you have grief, that is an amazing gift. And I think definitely I'm going to say in a Western culture, there's kind of this like, okay, Margaret, it's been 90 days, you're done. And I actually remember one time going to an event and knocking on the door. And I felt so sorry for the person who opened the door because she just looked so horrified, my interpretation, that it was me. And it's like she drew the short straw and she's like, oh gosh, I have to talk to the widow. And she did absolutely the best she could. And I just felt like she was very uncomfortable, and she did the best she could to invite me in and show me where refreshments were. And then she started to kind of stammer out, oh, I'm so sorry that I never called you, which, was fine. She didn't know me that well. But I guess she felt like she had to give me this apology. And then she ended it with, but it's been, I forget now, but it's been 8 weeks now, and you should be fine, was the end of the sentence. And then she turned and walked away, which was probably the best thing, because my existence was making her uncomfortable. And I also didn't want to make her more uncomfortable, but I also didn't know what to say in exchange other than to just be quiet and smile. And so that listening, like you're doing for me right now, that is a lovely thing.
Well, it's extremely personal. And I think that we all need more experience in how to deal with these difficult conversations.
Yeah.
And now at the San Francisco Zen Center, they actually have conversations around dying, where support groups come together, people who are facing death themselves or dealing with the imminent loss of a loved one can come together and talk about it. It's awkward because we don't know how. It's like race. It's awkward for people because they have no experience with it. Yes. So the more experience we gain, the easier it will be to deal with difficult issues, whatever they may be. And now in Hawaii, for example, we have a custom of celebrating the life of those who pass away. A funeral is not necessarily a morbid occasion. Again, it's culture specific.
Right.
But more and more, we find that people are holding celebrations of life rather than sort of mourning, collectively mourning. And there's a place for that too.
Sure.
In certain religious traditions, at least give it 24 hours to really mourn, or a week. But there's also a place for posting photos. I remember posting photos of my mom, and in all her different life phases, and in a way it served as a kind of happy distraction, and it also helped other people to get to know her. Many of them did not know about her early life and all the things that she'd done and so on. So it was a way of lightening the atmosphere around her death. I think it was very helpful and healthy. So that's another way to go about it. Being sensitive and learning to listen compassionately. Often, some people don't want to talk about it, at least for some period of time. Later on, they may be ready to open up, but not to force those conversations. We just need more experience, more techniques, more learning about how to help people who are dying. And not just professionals, but all of us.
Right. We need practice, and we don't, not all of us, but we need practice, and yet sometimes it's a thing we don't want to practice, and so we only do it when we have to. And so if there's a thing I only do when I have to, then I'm not as skilled at it.
Well, yes, I think that's a big mistake, especially in relation to death. We don't want to think about it. Death denial is very common. It was much more common before the AIDS pandemic. It was really socially unacceptable to raise the question of death in public before that time. But now things have opened up a lot. Yes. And I think that's a very good sign, a very hopeful sign. Now with the hospice movement, people are getting more adept at. We can ask someone, have you thought about hospice? It's a resource that's now available that was not available earlier. And in the United States, the hospices are well developed. They have lots of services to offer to families and so on. So we gain more experience, we gather more techniques, we get better at it. But you see, that also prepares us for our own death. And dealing with loss also prepares us for losing our own identity at the end of life. That's where a lot of the fear comes from. We're attached to ourselves, most of all. And most of us are not ready to take leave of our bodies, much less our identities that we spent our whole life creating.
Yes.
All those friendships, all of those degrees, all of those, vacations. It's, and now it's absolutely meaningless. Now, facing this in advance is much wiser. Having to cope with all of that at the last moment of death.
That's a lot.
Yes. It's much too much. And anyway, as I learned through my snake bite experience, it's possible that we'll be in great pain. It's possible that we'll be given medications to help us deal with the pain, which fog the mind. So it's much better that we think about these things in advance. And the Buddhists do it as a meditation, actually imagining one's own passing. This is very, very helpful. Sounds morbid, but actually it's very, very realistic and helpful.
Yeah, I do understand that it sounds morbid. I don't feel like it's morbid. I do believe, like you, that it is useful. And I remember when my father was dying, my father had lung cancer and it was terminal, and he knew, and he didn't die as a Buddhist. He died as a Catholic, but he was so good about, I felt like, the right combination of reverence and irreverence, if I can say it that way, of just, when he was having a good day, we would enjoy the good day, but he would look at you sometimes and just say, hey, remember, no one gets out of this alive. And then he would kind of laugh.
Yeah.
And then what was the other thing he would say? Sometimes he'd say, it would never occur to me to ask why me. The right question is why not me? And so in a way, I always felt like, and then 2 years later, my husband died of the same type of cancer. And I always felt like my dad, my husband died as a Buddhist, but I felt like my dad was like his death coach. And so that in the way in which my dad went through his transition, it helped Ed go through his transition. And so, yeah, it definitely helped him with his practice of getting ready to go.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Whenever we experience a loss, a death of a friend or a loved one, or even an acquaintance, we can consider that to be very fortunate in the sense that it wakes us up. It wakes us up to the reality of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the real beauty of doing meditation on death, is that it reminds us of the preciousness of every moment of life.
Mm-hmm.
Human life is something very special, difficult to attain, and very tenuous. We
Yes.
can lose it, especially now we all know every day we're alive is a blessing, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so when someone passes away, we can thank them because they've helped us to revisit, to remember the importance of being aware
Mm-hmm.
and being thankful for every precious moment.
Absolutely. And I was able to do a death meditation with my dad and with my husband. It was harder with my husband, I will confess that. I was able to sit down and meditate on the fact that they were dying and that they were going to die and that there was going to be the day when they died and there was going to be the day when they were gone. And it was so difficult. I won't tell you it wasn't difficult. But I will say that it was so helpful. And there were days when I thought, okay, you will get to a point where you're making it easier on yourself. You may never be 100% prepared, but you're going to be okay. And you're right. And it was tremendously helpful to be able to contemplate their death, and also my own. But obviously during those times, I was more obsessed with with their pending deaths. Now my own.
Well, you see, there are many ways to reimagine the dying process,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of the moments that we spend with a relative or a friend who's dying are sort of burdened by this sense of our own clinging, our own unfulfilled expectations, our own disappointment, their disappointment. They may, especially if we allow that cloud to enter the room when we're sitting with a dying person, it also affects them. Then they feel that they are disappointing us. Whereas, life is just is it's inevitable. Death is an inevitable part of life. It's not a failure. But in our youth culture, we've come to expect everyone to be, hopping around and young forever, which is totally unrealistic, right? So we can reimagine how we are with the dying person. It's great to hear that your father was able to keep his sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a friend like that too. She was joking on her deathbed,
Yeah.
literally on her deathbed. And it was really amazing. And it completely changed the atmosphere in the room.
On Monday, the woman that I spoke with, and I mentioned her to you previously, and she has been doing a lot. She's been teaching Dharma in the prisons for 10 or 12 years. And she was talking about her own when her husband died. And she said the last thing he did, his last conscious act, was he made her laugh.
Oh,
Isn't that sweet? Yeah.
that's sweet.
Yeah, it's so sweet.
Beautiful. Now, of course, here we're talking about the privileged. Okay, in this moment, this Black Lives Matter movement, we are all reminded that people experience life differently.
Yes.
So let's remember too that although it is within our means to transform the moment of dying, because we're in a situation that allows that. We have enough food, we have hopefully adequate medical care, we have a roof over our head. This is not the experience of everyone dying. I remember attending a funeral for the homeless dead in San Diego. 80 names were read out of people who had died that year on the streets. And it was multi-faith, it was, interfaith gathering. As we said our prayers, other names were raised by the people who attended of others who had died on the streets, cold, alone, homeless, often hungry. You see? So now we also have to recognize that that is a reality for many people today as we speak. So that arouses thoughts of compassion. And this is one of the techniques that dying people can also use, and their caregivers, to generate loving kindness and compassion for all the other people who are dying at that time throughout the world, right? People who are dying in much less advantaged circumstances, sometimes really horrible circumstances, with no healthcare, no food, no water, no one to attend to them. I mean, that opens our hearts. And it's also a kind of reality check.
Yes.
Right? And makes our own pain and suffering also feel less.
Sometimes I say I have good news and I have bad news. And the good news is there's so many causes that one can jump in and help with. There's a lot of work to be done, so jump in. And then I also say, and the bad news is there's so many causes to jump in and help with. But this is how it is.
Well, I think we each need to choose what we will do in this world to make our lives meaningful. And this is an important issue that's coming up for many people at this time, a crisis of meaning. We thought we had our lives figured out. Many people had them pre-programmed, pre-planned. Students, I'm dealing with many students whose lives have been completely thrown into the winds and having to completely re-envision what they will do with their lives. But I think that it can be a really positive moment. And now we may reconsider some of our selfish goals of just piling up money and acquiring material possessions and, doing things that would bring us individual pleasure. Maybe more people will begin to recognize that a meaningful life, a happy life, often is one that's dedicated to helping others. And now more needs means more opportunities that we can pursue in order to bring benefit to the world. So that's a silver lining.
I'll try to keep it to just 2 more questions. Is there anything else you would like people to know that you feel will really be helpful to them in this world of transitory state of impermanence and death and life?
I think the important thing is for us to have an open heart. To have an open heart to meet each person wherever they may be. We have a tendency to want to change others, whereas the only person we can really change is ourselves. But often by intending to transform others, we do them an injustice. What I hope we can learn from this pandemic is to open our hearts and really listen to the people around us. We don't know if we're going to be alive tomorrow, and we don't know if our loved ones are going to be alive tomorrow. And we know from all that we've discussed that at the time of death, we don't want to die with regrets. We should live in a way that we can sleep well at night and die without regret. So how do we do that? We make every encounter with every precious sentient being. That would include animals and humans of all ages, all backgrounds. We see so much cruelty in the world today, so much unnecessary hardship. We should be the ones who bring that into balance. We balance that out by generating tremendous compassion and kindness for everyone we meet. And we may feel helpless in the situation where people are, threatening others with guns, and it's just every day is another outrage. It's unbelievable to see how people are acting out. But we can help to offset that by bringing more compassion, more love into the world, and sharing it with everyone we meet. Because it has a ripple effect. When we are kind to others, then the likelihood is greater that they will be kind to everyone they meet that day. And gradually, through this sort of ripple effect, it can reach in all directions. With email, it can reach to the ends of the earth.
Yes.
So imagine the power that we have. And this helps us to avoid becoming depressed. People are wondering, oh, I can't do anything about all this. No, we can. We can do a tremendous amount of good in the world simply through our thoughts and our everyday actions of kindness.
Mm-hmm.
So I would try to challenge everyone, a call to action, if you will.
A call to action.
Now, how much love can you bring into the world today? Take it day by day, like AA, today.
Every
How
day.
much love, how much compassion, how much wisdom can you share today?
That's beautiful. Is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
If we don't have experience with dying, if we don't have people around us who are sick and on the way out, then let's find some. There are a lot of people who are lonely and isolated, elderly, infirm, fragile, who really would be so grateful for someone stopping by to share a cup of tea or help them with their groceries or something. Reaching out to others would help to bring death down from the clouds as a philosophical construct into a living reality. I think that would be so beautiful.
It would.
It's a kind of tangible expression of this heart of compassion we were talking about. So let's do that.
This has been the Death Dhamma podcast with Margaret Maloney. Thank you for being here. Your reviews and comments are greatly appreciated. And please come find me on margaretmaloney.com. MargaretMeloni. And don't forget to check out Carpooling with Death, How Living with Death will make you stronger, wiser, and fearless. Available in all your favorite formats over on Amazon. And most importantly, may you be well. May you be happy. May you be safe, at ease, and free from suffering. Bye for now.